How much you weigh last week?
295.
295. How much you weigh now, Fred?
301.
Did you misunderstand the goal here, Fred?
From a producer's lie that saved a legendary casting to a fictional university that became real, Coach wasn't your typical sitcom. With Craig T. Nelson storming out of his audition, convinced he'd bombed, Jerry Van Dyke turning down Gilligan's Island for TV's worst show, and Bill Fagerbakke calling Patrick's star AquaDauber for years, this football comedy hid more surprises than a trick play. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Coach. Fact 1. The casting lie that saved the show. Creator Barry Kemp knew from the very beginning that Jerry Van Dyke was absolutely perfect for the role of Luther Van Dam. Van Dyke had a well-earned reputation in Hollywood for being terrible at auditions, and ABC executives were insisting on seeing him rid for the part before they would approve the casting. Kemp understood that if Van Dyke came in and bombed the audition like he had done so many times before, the network would reject him, and the show would lose its ideal Luther. So Kemp did what any desperate producer would do in that situation. He lied to the network. He told ABC executives that Van Dyke was unfortunately unavailable because he was out on tour and couldn't possibly make it to Los Angeles for an audition. Instead of bringing Van Dyke in to read, Kemp sent the network a tape of Van Dyke's performance from a different television show, presenting it as proof of his abilities. The executives watched the tape and were impressed enough to approve the casting without ever seeing Van Dyke audition for the actual role of Luther. Van Dyke himself later confirmed this story in interviews, admitting that he really was awful at auditions and that Kemp's creative solution probably saved his career. Without that strategic deception, one of television's most beloved sidekick characters might never have existed, and the chemistry between Hayden Fox and Luther Van Dam that became the heart of Coach would have been completely different. Fact 2. Craig T. Nelson's disastrous audition.
I gotta do this, but I'll be right back. All right? You guys think you're ready to play football Saturday?
Craig T. Nelson walked out of his audition for Coach absolutely convinced that he had just experienced one of the worst professional disasters of his entire acting career. The audition took place in front of a room full of ABC network executives who would ultimately decide whether Nelson would get to play Hayden Fox. And from Nelson's perspective, the whole thing was an unmitigated catastrophe. He could feel the cold, judgmental stares from the executives as he performed, and their reactions seemed to confirm his worst fears about how badly things were going. The awkward silence in the room was so unbearable that Nelson didn't even wait for the customary polite dismissal. He simply got up and left before the audition was officially over, walking out convinced he had just embarrassed himself in front of some of the most powerful people in television. He went home that day certain that he would never hear from ABC again and that the role of Coach Hayden Fox would go to someone else. But the very next morning, Nelson's phone rang with news that completely shocked him. ABC was offering him the role. The executives had actually loved his audition and wanted him for the part immediately. What Nelson had interpreted as disapproval and discomfort was apparently just the normal poker-faced demeanor of network executives watching auditions. The role that Nelson thought he had completely botched ended up becoming one of the defining performances of his career, earning him an Emmy Award and making him a television star. Fact 3. The fictional university became real.
Though, I have to be honest. I hate football.
When Coach premiered in 1989, the setting of Minnesota State University was completely made up by the show's creators. There was no actual Minnesota State University anywhere in the real world. It was purely a fictional institution created for the sitcom, chosen because it sounded generic and believable enough for a college football comedy. For 9 seasons, the show followed the adventures of Coach Hayden Fox and his team at this entirely imaginary university, and nobody thought twice about the fact that the school didn't actually exist. But then something truly bizarre happened in 1998, 1 year after Coach ended its run on television. Mankato State University, a real school located in Mankato, Minnesota, decided to rebrand itself as part of a larger reorganization of the Minnesota State University system. When they were looking for a new name, they chose Minnesota State University, Mankato, the exact same name that had been fictional on the television show. The timing was so close to the show's finale that it seemed almost like the real university was intentionally borrowing from the sitcom, though there's no evidence that the show directly influenced the decision. Suddenly, the completely made-up school where Hayden Fox had coached the Screaming Eagles was now a real place where actual students attended classes and real football players competed. The coincidence was so strange that fans of the show couldn't help but wonder if life was imitating art, and whether anyone at the real Minnesota State University had ever even watched Coach before giving their school the same name. Fact 4. AquaDauber became Patrick Star.
Hey, Dob. Something the matter with your head there?
I don't have it anymore.
Bill Fagerbakke spent 7 years playing the lovable but dim-witted assistant coach Dauber on Coach, and when the show ended in 1997, he needed a new job. That same year, he went into audition for a brand new animated show that was being developed by Nickelodeon called SpongeBob SquarePants, and the creators were looking for someone to voice Patrick Star, the dopey pink starfish who would become SpongeBob's best friend. Fagerbakke landed the role, but he later admitted in interviews that for the first few years of working on SpongeBob, he had serious trouble separating his new character from his old one. He kept thinking of Patrick Star as essentially an underwater version of Dauber, and he even started calling the character AquaDauber in his own mind as a way to help himself understand how to play the role. The connection made sense because both characters shared similar personality traits. They were both sweet-natured, not particularly bright, and completely loyal to their best friends. Fagerbakke said that playing Dauber for so many years had created such a strong mental impression that he couldn't help but draw on that experience when he was figuring out Patrick's voice and mannerisms. Eventually, as SpongeBob became more successful and continued for years beyond Coach's run, Fagerbakke was able to separate the two characters in his mind and let Patrick develop his own distinct personality. But in those early episodes of SpongeBob, fans of Coach might notice that Patrick Star sounds an awful lot like Dauber would if he lived under the sea in Bikini Bottom. Fact 5. Jerry Van Dyke's career curse. Jerry Van Dyke made what he later called the worst career decision of his entire life back in 1965, and he was still living with the consequences of that choice when he finally found redemption with Coach more than 2 decades later. Van Dyke was offered a role in a new sitcom pilot about a group of castaways stranded on a desert island, a show that would eventually be called Gilligan's Island. At the same time, he was also offered the lead role in a different sitcom called My Mother the Car, which had a premise about a man whose deceased mother is reincarnated as a talking automobile. Van Dyke thought the premise of Gilligan's Island sounded absolutely ridiculous and was convinced the show would be canceled after a few episodes, so he turned it down and chose My Mother the Car instead. Gilligan's Island went on to become one of the most beloved and enduring sitcoms in television history, while My Mother the Car was so spectacularly terrible that TV Guide magazine later ranked it as the second worst television show of all time. Van Dyke spent years being reminded of this disastrous decision, and it became a running joke in Hollywood that he had the worst instincts for picking projects. When he was cast as Luther on Coach, he was already in his late 50s and had largely been forgotten by mainstream audiences. But Coach finally gave Van Dyke the hit show he had been searching for his entire career, and his performance as Luther,
and the winner in Hollywood is Dick Van Dyke,
earned him 4 Emmy nominations, proving that he could succeed in television if given the right role. Fact 6. The theme song contest winner.
Marching band entered for the traditional field contest.
The marching band from Iowa State University won a very unusual contest in 1995 that gave them a permanent place in television history. Coach had been on the air for 6 seasons at that point, and the producers decided to hold a competition where college marching bands could submit recordings of themselves performing the show's iconic theme song. Bands from universities all across the country sent in their entries, each hoping to win the chance to have their version featured on national television. Iowa State's marching band submitted their recording, and when the producers listened to all the entries, they decided that the Cyclones had the best version of the theme music. The prize was significant. Iowa State's recording would replace the previous version and play during the opening credits of every episode from that point forward until the show ended. For the final 2 seasons of Coach, millions of viewers heard Iowa State's marching band playing that familiar tune every single week, though most people watching probably had no idea they were listening to actual college students from Iowa. The band members who participated in the recording got to see their work on ABC in prime time, and Iowa State became forever linked to the show in a way that no other university could claim. Fact 7. Dauber's 3 surprise degrees.
You know, you and I should do something for Kelly's birthday.
Sure. Maybe we could go out for a nice dinner or something.
During the show's run, the character of Dauber Dubinsky was consistently portrayed as not being the sharpest tool in the shed, often struggling with basic concepts and generally being naive about the world around him. So it came as a complete shock when an episode revealed that Dauber had somehow managed to graduate from Minnesota State University with not just 1, but 3 separate bachelor's degrees in physical education, business administration, and forestry. The truly bizarre part of this revelation was that Dauber himself had no idea he had earned all 3 degrees until someone at the university registrar's office pointed it out to him. Apparently, Dauber had been taking classes over many years without really understanding what he was studying or keeping track of his credits, and he had accidentally fulfilled the requirements for 3 completely different majors without ever intending to. The joke worked perfectly for the character because it captured the essential paradox of Dauber's personality. He was genuinely unintelligent in most practical ways, yet somehow stumbled through life achieving things that seemed impossible for someone with his limited cognitive abilities. The idea that someone could earn 3 degrees without even realizing it was absurd enough to be funny, while also being oddly touching, suggesting that Dauber's persistence and dedication could overcome his lack of natural intelligence. It also raised questions about how Minnesota State University's academic system worked if someone could accidentally complete 3 separate programs without anyone noticing until after the fact. But that was part of the absurdist humor that made the reveal so memorable. Fact 8. Dick Van Dyke's secret cameo. Jerry Van Dyke's famous older brother, Dick Van Dyke, made a brief appearance on Coach, but the show handled it in such a subtle way that most viewers probably never even noticed it happened. Dick Van Dyke appeared as an uncredited extra in one episode, playing one of Luther's distant relatives during a family gathering scene. The casting choice was clearly an inside joke for people who knew that Jerry and Dick were brothers in real life, but the show never drew attention to it with any dialogue or special focus on Dick's character. He simply appeared in the background as one of several relatives, and unless you were looking very carefully or already knew he was going to be there, you could easily watch the entire episode without realizing that one of television's biggest stars was standing right there on screen. The decision to keep Dick Van Dyke uncredited and in the background was probably intentional, avoiding the kind of stunt casting that would have turned his appearance into a distraction from the actual story. If the show had made a big deal out of having Dick Van Dyke guest star, it would have overwhelmed everything else happening in that episode and reduced the appearance to nothing more than a gimmick. By keeping it subtle and uncredited, the producers created a fun Easter egg for observant viewers and Van Dyke family fans, while maintaining the integrity of the episode itself. It was a classy way to acknowledge the real-life family connection between the Van Dyke brothers without exploiting it for cheap publicity or turning the show into a celebrity spectacle. Fact 9. Nelson and Van Dyke's rocky start. The on-screen chemistry between Coach Hayden Fox and Luther Van Dam was one of the key elements that made Coach such a successful show. But that natural rapport between the characters didn't exist right away for the actors playing them. Jerry Van Dyke admitted in interviews that Craig T. Nelson was not easy to get along with during the early days of production, describing him as pretty much a loner who kept to himself and didn't socialize much with the rest of the cast. Van Dyke said that he and Nelson had to consciously work on developing their chemistry together because it wasn't something that happened automatically the way it appeared on screen. Nelson had a reputation for being intense and serious about his craft, and his personality didn't naturally mesh with Van Dyke's more easygoing and jovial approach to acting. The situation could have been disastrous for a show that depended so heavily on the friendship between its two main characters, but both actors were professional enough to put in the effort required to make it work. They spent time together outside of filming, learning about each other's methods and finding ways to connect that would translate into believable performances. Over time, as they got more comfortable with each other and with their characters, the chemistry improved to the point where it seemed completely effortless. By the later seasons of Coach, it was impossible to tell that Nelson and Van Dyke had ever struggled to get along, and their performances made Hayden and Luther's friendship feel like one of the most genuine relationships on television. Fact 10. The show never showed actual games.
You're not playing today, son.
Despite being a show entirely centered around college football, Coach made a very deliberate, creative decision to avoid showing what most sports shows would consider the main event, the actual games themselves. Over 9 seasons and nearly 200 episodes, the audience never saw Coach Hayden Fox actually coaching his team during a game in progress. Instead, the show focused on what happened before and after games, featuring Hayden giving inspirational pregame speeches in the locker room or dealing with the aftermath of wins and losses once the final whistle had blown. This wasn't an accidental omission or a limitation of the show's budget. It was a conscious choice by the creators to keep Coach focused on character comedy rather than sports action. The writers understood that showing football games would require complex choreography, special camera work, crowd scenes, and all the technical elements that would have been expensive and time-consuming to produce. More importantly, focusing on the games themselves would have shifted the show's tone away from the workplace comedy and family dynamics that were its real strengths. By keeping the football off-screen, Coach could concentrate on the relationships between Hayden, Luther, Dauber, and the other characters without getting bogged down in sports logistics. The locker room became the primary setting instead of the field, turning Coach into a show about football people rather than football itself. This approach let the show appeal to viewers who didn't necessarily care about sports while still maintaining its identity as a football comedy. Fact 11. Nelson refused the Vegas crossover. In 1997, ABC decided to create a special crossover event that would connect 4 of its sitcoms together in one night, with characters traveling to Las Vegas and appearing on each other's shows. The network wanted Coach to participate alongside Drew Carey, Ellen, and Grace Under Fire, creating an elaborate stunt where characters from all 4 shows would interact in Vegas settings. But Craig T. Nelson absolutely refused to participate in the crossover, believing it was a gimmicky idea that didn't fit with the tone and style that Coach had established over its run. Nelson's refusal created a problem for the network because they had already promoted the crossover event and needed Coach to be part of it to make the whole thing work. The producers came up with a solution that satisfied both Nelson and ABC. Instead of having Hayden Fox go to Vegas, they sent Luther Van Dam in his place. Jerry Van Dyke was happy to participate in the crossover, so Luther became Coach's representative in the Vegas storyline, appearing on the other shows and interacting with their characters while Hayden stayed behind in Minnesota. The decision highlighted Nelson's willingness to stand up for his artistic principles even when it meant going against network pressure, and it showed that he took the integrity of Coach seriously enough to refuse what many actors would have seen as a fun opportunity for cross-promotion. The Vegas crossover went ahead without Hayden Fox, and the show continued on its own terms for the rest of its final season. Fact 12. The Newhart Universe Connection.
Where do you want to sit?
Next to the emergency exit.
Oh, all the emergency exits are gone.
The series finale of Coach included a surprise appearance that revealed the show existed in the same fictional universe as another beloved sitcom. Characters Larry, Daryl, and Daryl, the three strange woodsmen from the show Newhart, appeared in a scene set at Hayden's fishing cabin, establishing that both shows took place in the same world. This wasn't just a random celebrity cameo or a throwaway joke. It was a deliberate choice by creator Barry Kemp to connect his two most successful television shows together. Kemp had created both Newhart and Coach, and by bringing the characters together in Coach's finale, he was acknowledging that they were part of a shared creative vision. The appearance of Larry and the two Daryls was particularly meaningful for fans of Newhart because those characters had become iconic figures in television comedy, especially after Newhart's own legendary series finale that revealed the entire show had been a dream. Having them show up on Coach created a moment of nostalgia while also adding an extra layer of meaning to Coach's ending. It suggested that all the characters Kemp had created over the years existed in the same universe and could theoretically interact with each other, even if the shows themselves were set in different locations and time periods. The crossover was handled respectfully and didn't overwhelm Coach's own finale, but it gave longtime fans of both shows a special gift in the form of this unexpected connection that tied together two important pieces of television history. Fact 13. The meta-finale, Fourth Wall Break. The very last moments of Coach's series finale featured a strange and touching scene where Jerry Van Dyke's character Luther seemed to break the fourth wall and acknowledge that the show itself was ending. As the final episode wound down and the lights in the scene began to go dark, signaling the end of production, Luther started mumbling something that wasn't part of the scripted dialogue. He said, "I don't care what you say, I'm coming to work Monday," refusing to accept that Coach was actually over and that there would be no more episodes to film. The line was delivered in a way that blurred the distinction between Luther Van Dam, the character, and Jerry Van Dyke, the actor, creating ambiguity about whether Luther was talking about coming back to coach football or whether Van Dyke was talking about showing up to the set to continue making the show. It was a meta moment that acknowledged the reality of the show's cancellation while staying true to Luther's character, who had always been portrayed as somewhat oblivious to reality and stubbornly optimistic even when circumstances suggested otherwise. For Van Dyke personally, the line carried extra emotional weight because Coach had given him the career comeback he had spent decades trying to achieve, and saying goodbye to Luther meant saying goodbye to the role that had finally made him a respected television actor. The moment gave the finale a bittersweet quality that went beyond the usual sitcom ending, acknowledging both the fictional world of the show and the real world of television production in a way that was touching without being overly sentimental. Fact 14. Shelley Fabres's Elvis connection. Christine Armstrong, who became Coach Hayden Fox's wife on the show, was played by actress Shelley Fabres, and her casting created an interesting connection to music history that probably went over most viewers' heads. Before Fabres joined Coach in its second season, she had starred in 3 different Elvis Presley movies during the 1960s, Girl Happy, Spin Out, and Clambake, playing the romantic leading lady opposite Elvis in all 3 films. This created an unintentional layer of irony on Coach because one of the running jokes about Luther Van Dam was his obsessive devotion to Elvis Presley and his music. Luther was constantly making references to Elvis, quoting his songs, and treating the late singer like a religious figure worthy of worship. So the show had a situation where Luther was obsessed with Elvis while working alongside a woman who had actually kissed Elvis on screen in multiple movies. Yet the show never acknowledged this connection or made any reference to Fabre's history with the King of Rock and Roll. It would have been easy to write a storyline where Luther discovered Christine's past and became starstruck, but the writers apparently decided to keep Fabre's Elvis connection separate from her character on Coach. The decision to ignore such an obvious opportunity for comedy suggests that the producers wanted Christine to be her own character rather than having her defined by Fabre's previous work, even though acknowledging the Elvis connection would have given them material for several episodes worth of jokes about Luther's reaction to meeting someone who knew his idol personally. Fact 15. Dauber's Super Bowl. Epilogue. The series finale of Coach revealed what happened to the characters after the show ended, and Dauber Dubinsky's future turned out to be the most surprisingly successful of everyone's. The finale showed that Dauber eventually became the head coach of the Minnesota State Breakers, taking over the program that Hayden Fox had built and leading it to even greater heights. Under Dauber's leadership, the Breakers won back-to-back Super Bowl championships, an achievement that seemed almost impossible given Dauber's history of being portrayed as someone who could barely understand basic football strategy. The revelation that Dauber became not just a competent coach but a championship-winning one was both funny and oddly satisfying, suggesting that all those years of learning from Hayden and Luther had actually taught him something valuable, even if he never seemed to be paying attention. But Dauber's success didn't stop with winning championships. The finale also revealed that he left coaching to join the Monday Night Football announcing team, becoming a television personality who provided commentary and analysis for one of sports broadcasting's most prestigious positions. The idea of Dauber as a Monday Night Football announcer was hilarious because it meant that the same person who had spent years misunderstanding simple concepts was now supposed to be explaining football to millions of viewers. But it also represented the ultimate validation of his journey from bumbling assistant to respected figure in the football world, even if the path to get there had been completely improbable.